The winter season is long over. I no longer have to worry about if my power goes out, how I'm going to heat my aquariums. But now it's the summertime, and with the summer comes another unique challenge. As an aquarist, we have to deal with the summer heat and our aquariums overheating. So in today's video, I want to give you guys my top 10 tips on how to cool your aquarium during the summer months. You'll also want to stick around to the end of the video because I have a special guest that's going to share their tip as well. Before we begin, I just want to make something very clear. Given the sheer fact that there's so many variables to different types of aquariums, like what size they are, what they're made out of, and what type of an aquarium it actually is, some of these tips may or may not apply to your aquarium and or be as efficient as you'd like them to be. With that said, I do urge you to try a few and see which one works best for your situation in terms of cooling your aquarium down. So in no particular order, let's start off with one that I've always recommended for power outages, for example, and that is floating a frozen water bottle in your aquarium. By simply floating them in your aquarium and hopefully having it near the output of a filter and allowing that water to be circulated a little bit more evenly, this will effectively slowly cool down your tank. Now, the bigger the bottle, the longer it will last. I suggest always having an extra frozen one on standby in the freezer so that you can rotate them as they thaw out. Surface agitation also plays a big role in your aquarium, and it does a couple of things for you. Obviously, the number one thing that it does is increase the overall surface area your aquarium actually has to offer. So by simply pointing the outputs of your filters up, or even an air stone, you are effectively creating a lot of surface agitation that will aid in both gas exchange as well as heat exchange. Now, the gas exchange is important because as the temperature rises in your tank, this will ensure that the CO2 is gassed off a lot faster, as well as the heat, which leads me into the next tip. Install a fan above your aquarium and ensure that it blows across the surface of your tank. You'll have to take your lids off to get the full effect of this. But for an example, as the hot air is rising, the fan will remove that hot air from the top of your tank, allowing it to cool down faster. This will also cool down your lights, but we'll get to that in a moment. Speaking of fans, this is a big one for me. If you have a lot of aquariums in a small room, you'll want to have proper ventilation and circulation of the air. Now, not everybody can install an air exchanger in their house, but something I personally do is get a small fan, open up my window, and suck the hot air out. Then have another oscillating fan that continuously blows air back and forth in the room, circulating it. This means that all of the hot air is circulated within the room and then sucked out of the window. That really cools the room down. So controlling the ambient room temperature is a huge one, which brings me to the next tip. However, this is going to be a larger investment not only to your aquariums, but as well as your home. I highly suggest getting an air conditioner and installing it close to your aquariums if you possibly can. It's pretty much that simple. If you control the ambient room temperature, you'll be able to keep your aquariums cooler. And speaking of investments, this leads me to my next tip. A commercial aquarium chiller. Now, these come in all sizes with the ability to cool down almost any sized aquarium, ranging from several $100s to several thousand. Now, obviously, that would be a massive investment, but depending on the type of fish that you have or the aquarium that you already invested in, this might be a wise choice to go with. With the mention of a commercial chiller, this leads me to a do-it-yourself chiller. Now, I've shown you how to build one of those in the past by simply taking a mini fridge, some garden hose, and an aquarium pump, which will effectively cool down your tank. However, that's really only going to be efficient on smaller tanks. It's not going to work that well on larger tanks. However, recently I've seen a lot of you sharing your do-it-yourself chillers with me, and I just wanted to say, good job. So with chillers in mind, we're now into looking at treating the water directly. And that leads me to my next tip. If your aquariums get a little too high, why not do a water change with cooler water? Now, I'm not talking a drastic difference, but a few degrees isn't going to hurt the fish. And I can assure you they're not going to mind an extra water change or two. This is something I personally do. I like to drain the tank 50%, and then when I'm adding in new water, I change it by about 4 degrees. In such a large volume of water, this really only drops the overall water temperature by about a couple of degrees, but at times that's all I need it to do. Obviously, the more water you change and the cooler the water is, the more you'll drop the temperature. But if you change the temperature too drastically and too soon, you're going to shock the fish. So be careful with that tip. On the note of doing water changes with cooler water, this leads me to my next tip. Installing a drip system on your aquarium. Now, a drip system is a continuous flow of cold water to the tank, and all of the dirty or warmer water will simply overflow out into a drain. Now I'm going to cover in detail on how I added a drip system to an established tank in a future video. With that said, a drip system can effectively lower the water's temperature as well, and you can adjust it by simply increasing the flow. Not only are you cooling your aquarium, but you don't have to do any water changes either. So with all of these tips aside, let's now look at the culprit that sometimes leads to heating your aquariums that we rarely take a look at. The actual equipment that runs your aquarium. I'm talking the pumps, the heaters, and lights. 3 things that could potentially be a source of heat. Let's start with the pumps. If you're running a sump like mine, a lot of the times we use an internal pump. Sometimes these internal pumps can put off quite a bit of heat, so you might want to consider switching out the type of pump for an external pump, and one that stays relatively cool. However, that's a pretty big change in investment, but it's certainly something to consider. Now, a lot of you that might have canister filters or hang on the back filters, you don't really have anything to worry about there. The next piece of equipment we commonly take for granted is our heaters. And in the summertime, unlike any other time of the year, it's probably best to make sure that they are calibrated to the temperature you set. If you don't know how to calibrate your heaters, make sure that you contact the manufacturer or potentially just check out their website and see if they have instructions on how to do it there. As for lighting, we all know that some lights can get pretty hot. You might not think yours is actually contributing to raising the temperature of your tank though. So my suggestion would be to simply put your hand under the light and see if you feel any warmth at all. If you do, well, that warmth has to go somewhere. If you feel any warmth, my suggestion would be to simply find a way to raise your lighting higher up off the tank. You could do this by simply putting a couple 2x4s or blocks on each side. It's not that complicated. And this will allow the heat to not go directly down into the tank. It'll also give you a bit of more light coverage. With the light now elevated, install one of those fans we talked about earlier and have it blow right across the top of the tank and take all of that hot air from the light as well as the tank and blow it away elsewhere. And while we're talking about the lights, if you can't elevate them or blow the heat away or eliminate them as a heat source, my suggestion would be simply adjust your photo period, meaning that you leave the lights on less or not at all. Obviously, you're going to have to decide on this, whether you have a planted tank or reef tank, or if you actually need the lights on there. If your lights are only there for viewing purposes, my suggestion would to turn them on only through peak viewing hours. Okay, so one last tip, and this is something a lot of people just simply do not consider. Now, we talked about it at the first of the video, though, and that is the material your tank is actually made out of, whether it's glass, acrylic, or plywood. Now, there's something called heat transmission. Now, this roughly translates into how quickly a material loses heat or heat can pass through it. Now, when it comes to glass, acrylic, and plywood aquariums, glass has a higher heat transmission than acrylic, acrylic has a higher heat transmission than plywood. And what this really breaks down to is their insulative properties. And when you're trying to hold in heat and or cold, the more insulation you have, the longer it can hold it in. So if we're looking to heat our aquariums, a glass aquarium will lose the heat faster than acrylic, and acrylic will lose the heat faster than plywood. And the same goes for chilling it or cooling your tank down. What I'm getting at is that if things get bad, you're going to have to insulate the tank. This will make sure that your cooling efforts become far more efficient. My suggestion would be simply to pick up some 1/4 inch styrofoam and wrap the entire perimeter of the tank. Not the top though. Now I know this is going to block off the whole tank and it's going to look ugly, but drastic times call for drastic measures. And of course in the evening when it cools down, you could take the insulation off and view your fish. Okay, so that was my top 10 tips on how to cool your aquarium. Now for a bonus tip from my friend Rachel.
Thanks, Joey, and hello, fellow DIY fish keepers. My basement fish room has a unique obstacle in that I don't have any windows to run exhaust fans when the temperatures get really hot like they have been. So what I've started doing to control the heat is attaching utility fans to the PVC that runs my central loop around the fish room. This not only blows cooler air across the surface of the tanks, but it also moves away any hot air that's accumulating at the ceiling line. Now what's really important in my fish room is that I have these plugged into the boxes run around my room that go to my central timer. This means as soon as my lights kick on in the morning, the fans kick on, hopefully preventing that accumulation of hot air and a more consistent temperature throughout the days and nights. Hope that helps.
Hey, thanks a lot, Rachel. It was really great to get an additional tip. Now, folks, I actually convinced Rachel to do an extra video on top of her regular video schedule and put it out tomorrow. She's also going to cover how she cools her aquariums and her fish room. If you're not familiar with who Rachel O'Leary is, she is the owner of Invertebrates by Miss Jinx and runs her own YouTube channel as well. However, I like to call her the Queen of Nano. With that said, she does also have some monster fish of her own. While you're over there checking out her videos, make sure that you subscribe as well and support what I like to describe as the best up-and-coming new aquarium channel that I've seen in years. Anyways, I hope that you guys enjoyed today's video. If not, join me next week and I'll have something new for you. I no longer have to worry about power. Ah, you son of a bitch.